Last time, Dr. Alara Hayes, the sunshine of St. Jude's, kept crashing into the icy walls of Dr. Celine Crowe. What began as cold avoidance cracked open after a brutal day. When Celine finally defended Alara with a fury that stunned the entire hospital. And in a quiet courtyard afterward, the walls fell completely, leading to the first embrace that neither woman could walk away from. If you want to see the part one, the link is in the description. Celine's scowl deepened. "I'm not cuddly. You're a persistent barnacle. I've simply ceased attempting to scrape you off." "It's a survival mechanism, ma'am." Alara hummed, snuggling closer and pressing a kiss to the side of her neck. "A survival mechanism? That makes you sigh contentedly when I do this." Celine did indeed sigh. A soft, involuntary sound she immediately tried to cover with a grumble. "That's a sigh of exasperation." "And the fact that you're holding my hand right now?" Alara prompted. Lifting their intertwined fingers from where they rested on her stomach, Celine looked down at their joined hands as if seeing them for the first time. She muttered something under her breath that sounded like, "Shut up." But her grip tightened, her thumb stroking a slow, unconscious rhythm over Alara's knuckles. The warmth between them was no longer deniable. It was a physical force, a radiant heat that filled Celine's once cold office, melting the frost from the windows and from around Celine's own heart. The storm cloud was learning, one grudging, grumbling moment at a time, to bask in the sunshine. The transformation within the sterile confines of Celine's office was one thing. It was a controlled environment, her territory, a stage where she could perform her grumpy acquiescence to Alara's presence with a semblance of control. But what began to happen outside the hospital walls was something else entirely. It was organic, unconscious, and far more terrifying in its simplicity. It started with the walk to the parking garage. Their shifts ended within 30 minutes of each other. A coincidence Alara secretly believed was karmic alignment, and Celine insisted was all in error she'd have to correct. The first time, it was just that, walking in the same direction through the long, echoing corridors, making stiff, minimal small talk about patient outcomes. Then one evening, as they pushed through the heavy doors into the crisp twilight air, Alara, shivering in her thin hoodie, instinctively reached for Celine's hand. It was a fleeting thing. Her cold fingers brushed against Celine's, and Celine, startled, jerked her hand away as if she'd been shocked. "Sorry," Alara mumbled, stuffing her hands into her pockets. "Cold." Celine said nothing. But the next evening, as they stepped outside into a chilly breeze, she hesitated. She saw Alara hug herself against the cold, and without a word, she reached out and took Alara's hand, enveloping it in her own. Her grip was firm, almost clinical, but her skin was warm. "Your circulatory efficiency is appalling," she stated, looking straight ahead, her face a mask of professional disapproval. Alara's heart did a funny little flip. "I'll work on that. See that you do." They walked the rest of the way to their cars hand in hand, neither mentioning it. It became a ritual. The moment they left the building, their hands would find each other. It was never a discussion. It was as essential and unremarkable as breathing. Celine's larger, capable hand would swallow Alara's smaller one, their fingers lacing together perfectly. They would walk in a comfortable silence, the tension of the day slowly leaching away with the shared warmth of their palms. The walks grew longer. Instead of heading straight to the garage, they'd sometimes take a detour through the small park adjacent to the hospital. They'd walk under the skeletal winter trees, their breath misting in the air, still holding hands. They talked about nothing and everything: a frustrating administrator, a promising new medical journal article, a funny movie Alara had seen. Celine's contributions were still mostly grunts and monosyllables, but they were listening grunts, engaged grunts. Then came the night of the mocktail. Alara was gushing about a new non-alcoholic mixology place that had opened downtown. "They have this drink with ginger, lime, and something called butterfly pea flower that changes color when you add the citrus. It's like a science experiment you can drink." Celine, as expected, looked profoundly unimpressed. "It sounds chemically dubious and frivolous." "Come on," Alara pleaded, swinging their joined hands between them as they walked. Just once for me. You can critique its pharmacological properties the whole time. It'll be fun." Celine sighed the sigh of the deeply put upon. "Fine, one and only. So I can properly deconstruct its pointlessness." The bar was everything Celine hated, loud, crowded, and full of what she termed unnecessary vibrancy. She stood stiffly by a high-top table, her arms crossed, while Alara animatedly ordered at the bar. When Alara returned with two vibrantly colored drinks, one a deep blue, the other a sunset orange, Selena eyed them with deep suspicion. "Go on," Alara urged, pushing the blue one toward her. "Add the lemon." With the reluctance of a bomb disposal, expert, Celine squeezed the wedge of lemon into the glass. The deep blue liquid swirled and transformed into a soft, shimmering lavender. Celine's eyebrows shot up. She couldn't help it. It was interesting. Alara beamed. "See, science." Selene took a cautious sip, her overly sweet. The ginger is pronounced. However acceptable for Alara, this was a 5-star rave. She clinketed her glass against Celine's to acceptable mocktails and excellent company. They stayed for an hour. Selene spent most of it critiquing the decor, the music, and the menus. Hyperbolic descriptions, but she never asked to leave. She watched Alara's animated face as she talked, her hands gesturing wildly, and found herself taking another sip of the frivolous, color-changing liquid. It was, she admitted only to herself, not entirely terrible. This, too, became a ritual. "Mocktail night," Selena always protested. She always had a ready list of reasons why it was a waste of time, and she always went. The physical ease between them began to extend beyond hand-holding. It was a language of its own, spoken in subtle, intimate gestures. Sitting side by side in a booth, Selene's arm would naturally find its way along the back of the seat, her fingers just brushing Alara's shoulder. When leaning over to show Selene something on her phone, Alara would rest her hand on Selene's thigh for balance, and Selene wouldn't flinch or move away. She just stole her own hand, her entire focus narrowing to that single point of contact. Once in the hospital cafeteria, Alara reached across the table and gently wiped a spot of yogurt from the corner of Selene's mouth with her thumb. Selene froze, her eyes wide, her lips parting slightly. The entire cafeteria might have vanished for all she knew. The world was reduced to the gentle scratch of Alara's thumb and the devastating softness of her touch. Alara just smiled, utterly unaware of the internal cataclysm she'd caused. "Got it," she'd said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. For Selene, each touch was a revolution. A handheld was a fortress stormed, an arm around her shoulder was a treaty signed. A thumb brushing her lip was the surrender of a lifetime of isolation. She was a woman learning a new alphabet of intimacy, one hesitant, grumbling, breathtaking step at a time. She found herself addicted to it, to the simple, solid warmth of Alara's hand in hers. It was an anchor in the storm of her own mind. During a difficult surgery, in the tense moments of waiting for a scan result, she would find herself unconsciously flexing the hand that Alara usually held, craving its steadying pressure. For Alara, it was a constant, quiet joy. She watched the cracks in Selene's armor widen every day, not with a chisel, but with the gentle, persistent pressure of sunlight. She saw the way Selene's shoulders would drop an inch when she took her hand. She heard the way her grumbles lost their sharp, defensive edge and became almost performative, a habit she kept up out of principle long after the meaning had faded. They were a study in contrast, the two of them, walking through the city evening. Alara in her bright puffer jacket, gesturing wildly as she told a story, her face alight. Selene beside her, a tall, dark figure in a long wool coat, her face seemingly stern, but her head tilted toward Alara, listening intently. And between them, connecting them, their joined hands, swinging gently with every step. The tension between them was no longer just about unspoken attraction. It was about the unbearable weight of all that was now spoken in silence, in every brush of a hand, every shared glance, every quiet moment in the dark. It was a constant, humming current under their skin, a promise that had yet to be kept, a question that hung in the air between every word they spoke. They were holding on, and neither of them had any intention of letting go. Part 7. Jealousy Burns. The hospital. Cafeteria was a study in controlled chaos, a cross-section of the institution's lifeblood. Nurses on quick breaks scarfed down sandwiches, interns stared blankly into cups of coffee, and senior consultants held impromptu meetings over stale pastries. In a corner booth, a small oasis of quiet had formed around Celine and Alara. It had become their unofficial spot. Celine was methodically dissecting a bland chicken salad, her movements precise and economical. Alara was animatedly recounting her morning, which had involved calming a terrified toddler by letting him listen to her heartbeat with a toy stethoscope. And then he said, "Your engine is too fast, doctor," Alara finished, laughing. The sound was bright and clear, a bell cutting through the cafeteria's dull roar. Celine didn't look up, but the faintest ghost of a smile touched her lips. It was a smile only Alara would recognize, a mere softening at the corners of her eyes. Tachycardic, even at rest. I could have told him that. "It's your default setting," she muttered, but there was no bite to it. It was their language. The peace was shattered by a familiar, overly confident voice. "Alara, just the woman I wanted to see." Dr. Julian Cross, a handsome and perpetually smammy orthopedic surgeon, slid into the booth next to Alara, his arm casually draping along the back of the seat behind her. He completely ignored Celine as if she were a part of the upholstery. Celine's knife stilled on her plate. Her entire body went preternaturally still, the way a predator freezes before a strike. "Julian," Alara said, her cheerful tone gaining a polite, professional edge. She subtly shifted an inch away from him. "I was thinking," Julian said, leaning in conspiratorially, his voice using charm, "that new Thai place downtown. Friday night, you and me. What do you say? A real date. Finally, no more hospital food." He said it with a winning smile, as if the offer were a foregone conclusion, a prize she'd been waiting to win. Alara laughed, a light, dismissive sound meant to deflect. "Oh, Julian, that's sweet, but I'm swamped with charts all weekend. Rain check." It was a gentle, clear rejection delivered with the kindness that was her nature, but Celine didn't hear the rejection. She heard the invitation, she heard his tone, possessive and familiar. She saw his arm behind Alara, claiming space that wasn't his. She saw the way he looked at Alara like she was a delectable dessert he decided to order. A cold, sharp spike of something pure and vicious lanced through Celine's chest. It wasn't annoyance, it wasn't irritation. It was a white-hot, blinding jealousy so potent and unexpected it felt like a physical blow. Her vision tunneled, the cacophony of the cafeteria fading into a dull roar. The carefully constructed world she'd been building with Alara, the walks, the hand-holding, the quiet moments in her office seemed to evaporate, revealed as a fragile illusion. Of course, someone else would see her. Of course, someone would try to take her. The thought was a visceral tear, a rending of something deep and essential inside her. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs refused to obey. The fork in her hand felt like a lead weight. She set it down with a quiet, precise click that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence of her own mind. Julian, oblivious, pressed on. "Come on, Alara. Live a little. You can't spend all your time." He finally flicked a dismissive glance at Celine working. Alara opened her mouth to give a firmer refusal, but she stopped. She felt the change in the air beside her. She turned her head. Celine was frozen. Her face, usually a mask of cool composure, was pale. Her skin stretched taut over the elegant bones of her cheeks. Her lips were pressed into a bloodless line, but it was her eyes that made Alara's breath catch. They were wide, dark, and utterly devastated. She was staring at a spot on the table, but seeing nothing. She looked lost, panicked, hurt. The charming banter, the gentle letdown, it all vanished from Alara's mind. Nothing existed but the shattered woman beside her. Without a second thought, without a care for Julian, for the cafeteria, for anything, she turned fully in her seat. She reached out, her movement slow and deliberate, and cupped Celine's face in both her hands. Celine flinched at the contact, her eyes snapping up to meet Alara. The raw, unguarded pain in them was a physical ache in Alara's heart. "Celine," Alara whispered, her voice soft but unwavering, a private universe of meaning in that single word. Her thumbs gently stroked the high planes of Celine's cheeks. "Look at me." Celine's breath hitched, a ragged, desperate sound. Alara held her gaze, her own eyes full of a fierce, protective certainty. "Of course I said no," she said, her voice dropping even lower, meant for Celine and Celine alone. The words were a vow. "I have you." She leaned in closer, her forehead almost touching Celine's, her eyes blazing with a truth she could no longer contain. "You're the only one for me." The words landed not as a comfort, but as a detonation. For Celine, it was the final collapse of the dam. Every wall, every defense, every last shred of her carefully maintained control was vaporized in the face of that raw, honest declaration. The fear, the jealousy, the years of loneliness, the overwhelming, terrifying love, it all surged up, a tidal wave that could no longer be held back. A broken half-sob escaped her. Her hands, which had been clenched into fists on the table, came up to clutch desperately at Alara's wrists, not to pull her away, but to anchor herself. And then she surged forward. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a desperate, claiming, furious clash of lips and teeth, and pent-up longing. It was years of silent yearning finally given voice. It was an answer to a question that had hung between them for months. Celine kissed her as if she were drowning, and Alara was air. She kissed her with all the ferocity of her storm, and Alara met her with all the warmth of her sun. For a moment, the world ceased to exist. The cafeteria, the stunned face of Julian Cross, the clatter of trays, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only the shocking softness of Alara's lips, the taste of her, the little sound of surprise and yielding she made against Celine's mouth. They broke apart, both breathing heavily, foreheads resting together. Tears of relief, of joy, of sheer overwhelming emotion streamed freely down both their faces, mingling where their cheeks touched. Julian Cross was gone, vanished. The booth was theirs. Celine's eyes were still closed, her body trembling with the aftershocks. Alara's hands were still on her face, her thumbs now wiping away the tears. The storm had broken, and the sunshine had welcomed it. Part 8. The first night, the world outside the cafeteria booth had ceased to exist. The kiss was an earthquake, and in its aftermath, there was only the trembling, raw landscape of the two of them. They broke apart, breathless, foreheads pressed. Together, their tears salting the space between their lips. The air crackled with the energy of a truth too long suppressed. Finally and violently set free, Celine's hands, which had been clutching Alara's wrists like a lifeline, slid down to desperately intertwine their fingers. Her eyes were wide, shimmering with a terrified wonder, as if she just jumped off a cliff and was shocked to find herself flying instead of falling. "My place," Celine breathed, the words ragged, more a plea than a statement. It was the only coherent thought in the whirlwind of her mind. She needed walls. She needed privacy. She needed to be anywhere but under the fluorescent lights of the hospital, where this fragile, miraculous thing between them might be seen and shattered. Alara could only nod, her own breath coming in soft, shaky gasps. Her lips were tingling, slightly swollen. She felt dizzy, euphoric, utterly anchored by the desperate grip of Celine's hands. They moved as one entity, stumbling out of the booth. Celine didn't let go of Alara's hand. She led her through the corridors, not with her usual purposeful stride, but with a new, urgent gravity. They were a spectacle. Two brilliant doctors with tear-streaked faces, hands locked together, walking with the singular focus of souls fleeing a disaster or racing toward a salvation. They ignored the curious glances, the raised eyebrows. None of it mattered. The drive to Celine's apartment was a blur of streetlights and silence. Celine drove with a white-knuckled intensity, one hand on the wheel, the other gripping Alara's thigh as if afraid she'd vanish. Alara rested her hand over Celine's, her thumb tracing calming circles on the tense skin. Neither spoke. The air in the car was thick with anticipation, with the ghost of the kiss that still burned on their mouths. Celine's apartment was exactly as Alara had somehow known it would be. A minimalist dream, all clean lines, muted tones, and stark modernity. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly devoid of personal warmth. A place to exist, not to live. The moment the door clicked shut, locking the world out, the fragile dam of silence broke. Celine turned, and Alara was there, pressed against the door, her eyes dark and full of a question. There was no more hesitation, no more fear. Celine framed Alara's face with her hands, her touch reverent now, not desperate. "Alara," she whispered, her voice with emotion. It was a prayer, a confirmation, and then they were kissing again. This time it was not a collision of desperation, but a slow, deep exploration. It was a rediscovery, a mapping of a territory they had only ever dreamed of. Celine's lips were softer now, seeking, learning the shape and taste of Alara's mouth with a heartbreaking tenderness. Alara melted into her arms sliding around Celine's neck, her fingers tangling in the perfect dark strands of her hair. Musing it, claiming it, they stumbled through the living room, a tangled mess of seeking hands and hungry mouths, shedding their coats, their shoes, leaving a trail of discarded life behind them. They reached the bedroom, a space as austerely beautiful and impersonal as the rest of the apartment. The only thing that mattered was the large, neatly made bed. Celine stopped at the edge of it, suddenly looking young and vulnerable. The fierce neurosurgeon was gone, replaced by a woman terrified of her own need. Her hands came up to cradle. Alara's face again, her thumb stroking her cheeks. I've never, she stumbled, her voice a raw whisper. I don't know how to do this. Not in a way that deserves you. Alara's heart swelled until it felt too big for her chest. She captured one of Celine's hands, bringing it to her lips and pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her palm. Just feel it, Celine, she whispered, echoing her own words from the courtyard. Just be with me. It was all the permission Celine needed. With trembling, achingly gentle hands, they undressed each other. It was not a frantic race, but a sacred unveiling. Each button of Celine's crisp shirt was a revelation, exposing skin that was pale and smooth. Each inch of Alara's bright scrub, top pulled away, revealed freckles and softness and warmth. They explored with hands and lips and whispered breaths. The strong line of Celine's back, the gentle curve of Alara's hip, the rapid, thrilling beat of each other's hearts. When they were finally bare, skin to skin in the moonlight room, they fell onto the cool sheets. Celine hovered above Alara, her dark hair curtaining their faces, her eyes drinking in the sight of her as if memorizing a miracle. You're so beautiful, Celine breathed, the words laced with awe, as if she were witnessing a phenomenon she'd only read about in texts. You're everything. Alara pulled her down, their bodies aligning, fitting together with a shocking perfect rightness. You're my everything, she whispered against her lips. What followed was not just sex. It was a conversation, a healing, a homecoming. It was passion tempered with a devastating tenderness that left them both breathless and crying. It was Celine, the woman of precise control, finally letting go, surrendering to sensation, to feeling, to the overwhelming rightness of being inside the woman she loved. It was Alara, the giver of comfort, finally allowing herself to be utterly taken, to be cherished and worshipped with a focus so intense it felt like a brand. Celine's touches were hesitant at first, then grew bolder, guided by Alara's soft sighs and eager responses. She learned the geography of Alara's pleasure with the same intense focus she gave to a complex surgery. But this time her hands were not tools of dissection, but instruments of worship. And when she finally brought Alara to a shattering peak, whispering her name like a secret against her skin, she felt her own control unravel in a wave of such powerful emotion it stole the air from her lungs. Afterward, they lay tangled together, slick with sweat and tears, their hearts hammering against each other's ribs in a slowing, synchronized rhythm. Celine buried her face in the curve of Alara's neck, her body shaking with silent, overwhelming sobs. Alara held her tightly, stroking her hair, whispering soft, nonsense words of comfort. "I've got you," she murmured. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Selene lifted her head, her face ravaged by emotion, more beautiful than Alara had ever seen her. "I don't deserve you," she choked out, the words a raw confession. "I'm too broken, too cold." Alara cupped her face, her expression fierce with, "Love, you are perfect," she insisted, her voice unwavering. "You are strong and brilliant and beautiful, and you are mine. Your storm, it doesn't scare me, it's part of you. I love all of you." The words hung in the air. The first time love had been spoken aloud, it wasn't a question anymore. It was a fact, as solid and real as the bed beneath them. They made love again through the night, slower this time, a deep languid exploration. They learned each other's bodies in the moonlight, trading soft touches and whispered secrets. The sterile apartment filled with the sounds of their passion, their laughter, their quiet tears. The storm had not just given way to the sunshine. They had merged, creating something new, something whole. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the blinds, they were wrapped around each other, limbs entangled, breathing as one, exhausted, sated, and utterly peaceful. Selene's head was pillowed on Alara's chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of her heart, a rhythm she knew she never wanted to be without. The fortress had been stormed. The sun had risen, and for the first time in her life, Dr. Selene Crowe felt truly and completely at home. Part 9, Addicted to Touch. The world had not ended. The sun had risen on a Tuesday, and St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital continued its relentless rhythm, utterly unaware that the fundamental chemistry of two of its most prominent surgeons had been permanently altered. But for Selene and Alara, every molecule of air, every speck of dust motes dancing in the fluorescent light, every hum of the havoc system felt different. They walked into work that morning, not as separate entities, but as a single humming circuit, forever closed. The transformation was not loud or declarative. It was a quiet seismic shift in the ecosystem of the hospital, noticed not in grand gestures, but in 1,000 tiny, breathtaking intimacies. Selene's external facade, for the benefit of the rest of the world, remained largely intact. The ice queen was still on her throne. She was still curt within turns, still intimidatingly precise in the O, and still capable of a glare that could freeze a running suture in its tracks. Her reputation for cold perfection was, to the casual observer, untarnished. But for Alara, the fortress gates were permanently thrown open. It started in the mornings. Alara would appear at the door of Selene's office, not with a hesitant knock, but with a soft, proprietary scratch before letting herself in. Selene would be at her desk, already deep in the day's charts, a frown of concentration on her face. Without looking up, she would wordlessly push her chair back from the desk, a precise 18 in just enough space. Alara would glide in, place a steaming cup of coffee, black, 1 sugar, on the desk, and simply settle herself sideways on Selene's lap. She'd hook one arm around Selene's shoulders, rest her head against her, and sip her own drink, sometimes reading over Selene's shoulder, sometimes just closing her eyes and breathing her in. Selene's hand would come to rest automatically on Alara's thigh, her thumb making absent, soothing circles through the fabric of her scrubs. She would continue working, her voice never losing its cool, professional tone if a resident poked their head in with a question, but her free hand would be stroking Alara's leg, a silent, constant acknowledgement of the warm, living weight in her lap. It was their new normal. The hospital staff, a collective of the most observant gossips on the planet, noticed everything. They noticed that Dr. Crowe's infamous "do not disturb" sign now had an unspoken asterisk that read, "except for Dr. Hayes." They saw Alara, after a particularly difficult case, walk straight into the neuro wing and into Selene's office without breaking stride. Through the slats of the blinds, a nurse saw not a conversation, but Selene, still seated, simply opening her arms. Alara walked into them, burying her face in Selene's neck, and Selene held her, one hand cradling the back of her head, her own eyes closed as she absorbed the other woman's dress. They stood like that for a full 5 minutes, a silent transfusion of strength. They witnessed the hand-holding, not just in the corridors, but in high-stress moments before tricky surgery. They'd be seen outside the O doors, gowned but not yet gloved, their bare fingers intertwined for a brief tight squeeze, a secret handshake of solidarity. In the cafeteria, Selini's hand would be resting on the table and Alara would be covering it, their thumbs engaged in a gentle idle dance. The gossip mill, once focused on their contrast, now chirped with amused, affectionate observations, saw sunshine on the storm clouds lap again during the morning briefing. A nurse would whisper at the station. Crowe was presenting the Rasmussen case, all business, and didn't even pause when Hayes fed her a grape. A grape? Another would gasp, laughing. I swear the world is ending. They'd roll their eyes, but it was fond. The once terrifying Dr. Celine Crown had been tamed. No, not tamed. Claimed, and the effect was oddly humanizing. Her sharp edges, while still present, no longer seemed designed to draw blood, but to define the space that was exclusively for Alara. The banter continued, but its texture had changed. It was no longer a defensive mechanism for Celine. It was a beloved, familiar dance. Alara snuggled on Zelini's lap while she typed a report would press a kiss to her jaw. You know, for the scariest. Neurosurgeon on the eastern seaboard, you give really good cuddles. Celine would grunt, not stopping her typing. I'm not cuddling. You are utilizing me as furniture. It's a parasitic relationship. Ma'am, Alara would hum, nuzzling closer. And you're my very favorite chair. A long-suffering sigh. I am enabling your laziness. Deny it all you want, Alara sang softly, tracing the shell of her ear. But your hand is holding my hip, and you're sighing contentedly. Selini's fingers would flex on Alara's hip, pulling her infinitesimally closer even as she muttered, It's a sigh. Of exasperation, the sound of my productivity dying. They were addicted to each other's presence, to each other's touch. It was a physical need as vital as oxygen. A brush of fingers in a passing hallway could steady Selini's focus for a grueling 3-hour surgery. The weight of Selini's hand on the small of her back could dissolve the lingering anxiety of a lost patient. For Alara, they were caught more than once in compromising positions. A junior doctor sent to fetch Dr. Crown for a consult opened the door to the on-call room to find them pressed against the wall, locked in a deep, passionate kiss. Selini's hands tangled in Alara's hair as if she were drowning. He backed out, stammering apologies, and the story was legend within the hour. Another time, a pharmacist looking for a missing vial found them in a dimly lit supply closet. They weren't even doing anything more scandalous than embracing Selina's face buried in Alara's hair. Alara whispering something that made Selini's body shake with silent laughter. It was the sight of Celine Crown alone that was the real scandal. Their colleagues pretended to be exasperated, but secretly they adored them. They were the hospital's worst-kept secret and its favorite love story. The brilliant, intimidating storm cloud and the warm, vibrant sunshine forever intertwined. They had both spent their lives being exceptional alone. Now they were discovering the terrifying, glorious wonder of being exceptional together. They had, against all odds in their own natures, finally found a home, not in a place, but in the steady beat of each other's hearts and the constant, reassuring pressure of each other's touch. Part 10, Sunshine and Storm Cloud Forever. The deep, resonant quiet of a hospital after midnight was a world apart from its daytime chaos. The frantic energy had bled away, leaving behind a hushed sacred space where the only sounds were the distant, soft-soled footsteps of a nurse on rounds, the intermittent beep of a monitor down the hall, and the low hum of the building itself, breathing in the dark. In Celine Crowe's apartment, a similar peace had descended. The stark, modern lines of the room were softened by the moonlight filtering through the blinds, painting silver stripes across the rumpled bed sheets, and the two forms nestled within them. They were a study in contrast, even in sleep. Alara was sprawled on her stomach, one arm flung out, her hand resting possessively on Selini's hip, her face smooth and untroubled, half buried in a pillow. Her blonde hair was a messy halo, catching the moonlight. Celine, true to her nature, slept on her back with a disciplined stillness, but her head was turned toward Alara, her face softer in repose than Alara had ever seen it awake. One of her arms was curled around Alara's shoulders, her hand resting on the warm skin of her back, a permanent anchor even in unconsciousness. It had been another marathon day, a complex spinal procedure for Celine that had run hours over time, followed by a sudden emergency laparotomy for Alara. They had stumbled through the door together, leaning on each other, their bodies humming with a fatigue that was bone deep. There had been no energy for anything more than shared showers, soft kisses, and the simple, profound relief of collapsing into bed, into each other's arms. Alara stirred first, not from a nightmare, but from a deep-seated sense of contentment. She blinked, her eyes open, adjusting to the dim light. Her first sight was Celine's profile, the elegant line of her nose, the dark fan of her lashes against her cheek, the slight part of her lips. A wave of such powerful love washed over her that it felt like a physical ache. She shifted slightly, propping herself up on an elbow to better look at the woman beside her. Her movement, slight as it was, disturbed Celine's vigilant sleep. Celine's eyes fluttered open, and for a heart-upping second, they were clouded with the old instinctual weariness. Then her gaze found Alara, and the walls didn't just lower, they vanished completely. Her eyes in the moonlight were dark pools of unguarded affection. "Hey," Alara whispered, her voice raspy with sleep. "Hey," Celine whispered back, her own voice a low, warm rumble. Alara's fingers began to trace idle loving patterns on Celine's stomach over the soft cotton of her tank top. "I was just lying here thinking," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Celine's hand came up to cover Alara's, stilling its movement, holding it against her. "A dangerous pastime," she quipped softly, but her tone was tender. Alara smiled. Small private thing. I was thinking about how I used to believe with my whole heart that you hated me." The words hung in the quiet air. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of a past truth, a testament to how far they had come. Celine's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. She turned onto her side fully, facing Alara, their noses almost touching. The moonlight caught the sheen of tears, welling in her eyes, but they didn't fall. She brought her hand up to cup Alara's cheek, her thumb stroking the apple of her cheek with a reverence that still sometimes stole Alara's breath away. "I know," Celine said, her voice thick with emotion that went deeper than regret. It was a profound understanding of a past self she could scarcely recognize. "I know you did, and I wanted you too." She swallowed hard. It was easier, safer. She took a shaky breath, diving into the vulnerability that was now miraculously her sanctuary and not her prison. "I didn't hate you, Alara. I never could." She paused, gathering the words she'd only ever spoken to herself in the darkest hours of the night. "I hated that you made me feel things I couldn't control. I hated that you saw through me right from the start. You saw the person under the reputation, and you liked her. You challenged her. You brought her coffee." A single tear finally escaped, tracing a silent path down her temple and into her hairline. "You terrified me." Alara listened, her own eyes glistening. She leaned forward and kissed the tear track away, her lips soft and reassuring. "My brave, brilliant storm cloud," she whispered against Celine's skin, so scared of a little sunshine. Celine let out a wet, shaky laugh that was half a sob. She pulled Alara closer until their foreheads were resting together, their breath mingling. "It wasn't the sunshine I was afraid of," she confessed, her voice a raw whisper. "It was the thaw. I was so afraid of what would happen if all that ice finally melted. I thought there'd be nothing left of me." "And now," Alara prompted softly, her hand coming up to rest over Celine's heart, feeling its strong, steady beat. Celine's answer was a kiss, deep and slow and full of a love that had been hard-won. When she pulled back, her eyes were clear and certain. "Now I know the ice was just the shell. The thing underneath, it was always yours. It just didn't know how to come out until you called for it." Alara's smile then was like the dawn, brilliant and full of promise. She brushed a stray strand of dark hair from Celine's forehead. "Then don't control it anymore," she whispered, echoing her own wisdom from the courtyard. The words now a mantra for their future. Just feel it, all of it with me. It was an invitation to a lifetime of vulnerability, of feeling, of glorious, unscripted emotion. And Celine, who had spent a lifetime building fortresses, finally had the one thing worth surrendering for. A profound peace settled over her features. She captured Alara's hand from her cheek and brought it to her lips, pressing a long, lingering kiss to her knuckles, a silent vow. I am, she whispered, her voice steady and sure now, filled with a certainty that would never again waver. I'm not going anywhere, Alara, not ever. The promise hung between them, simple and monumental. It needed no elaboration. It was in the way their bodies fit together, in the way they had learned to speak without words, in the way Celine's stormy intensity now existed not to push away, but to protect the warmth they had built. Alara shifted, curling herself back into the shelter of Celine's body, fitting her back against Celine's front, sighing contentedly as Celine's arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her close. Celine buried her face in the sweet-smelling juncture of Alara's neck and shoulder, inhaling the scent that had become her definition of home. Their breathing slowly synchronized, deepening as sleep began to claim them once more. The future stretched out before them, unwritten, undoubtedly filled with the challenges of their demanding lives, with difficult days and heartbreaking losses. But its foundation was no longer uncertain. It was as solid as the beat of their two hearts, finally in rhythm. Outside, the first faint hints of dawn began to lighten the edge of the sky. A new day was coming. But in the quiet apartment, wrapped in each other, they were already home. Sunshine and storm cloud, forever intertwined. Forever healed, forever.